I want you to imagine something with me. You're 25 years old. You've done everything right on paper. You've gone to college. You've gotten a decent job. You are saving money. But when you look at your bank account and you think about your future financial goals, like buying a home, saving for retirement, you feel like you just can never get ahead, no matter how much work you do. Now imagine that feeling multiplied across an entire generation, because that is exactly what's happening to Gen Z right now. Nearly 80% of Americans under the age of 30 don't believe the American dream holds true anymore. Not that it's harder to achieve, that it's fundamentally impossible. And when that psychological infrastructure collapses, it can create ripple effects that reshape how an entire generation thinks about money, work, and success. For generations, the American dream followed a very simple formula: work hard, save money, buy a home, raise a family, retire comfortably. And this wasn't just financial advice, it was the psychological infrastructure supporting how entire generations thought about money and success. But here's the thing: when that infrastructure collapses, people don't just shrug and continue on as business as usual. Their entire relationship with money changes. And Gen Z's response isn't reckless, it is a rational adaptation to a broken system. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about why the American dream is dead, especially for Gen Z, how that's reshaping Gen Z's relationship to money, and what is emerging to replace it. So let me explain a little bit about the economic reality that Gen Z is currently living in. Let's start with education. So college tuition has increased 180% since 1980, which has massively outpaced inflation and wage growth. In 1980, the average tuition at a public university was about $1,500 in today's dollars. And today, that's over $10,000, and that is just including tuition. Gen Z is starting their entire adult lives with debt loads that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. The average student loan borrower has about $30,000 in loans, and those are financial shackles that can follow you for decades, since student loans are nearly impossible to discharge during bankruptcy, and they're a huge amount. Okay, so that's one part of it. Now let's talk about housing, which has traditionally been the cornerstone of the American dream. In 1980, the median home to price income ratio was about 4-to-1. Today, it's about 7.5-to-1, which means in practical terms that you need a ton more money than you previously did to be able to afford a home. Studies have found that you need an annual household income of almost $120,000 just to afford the medium priced American home. So let's pretend you wanted to buy a home that was worth $450,000, which is around the average in America. With a 20% down payment, you would need $90,000 in cash up front. And if you're saving $500 a month, which is more than most people can manage, it would take 15 years just to save for the down payment. The median age of first-time homebuyers hit 38 in 2024, which was an all-time high. So home ownership that used to be something you might achieve in your 20s is now being pushed into middle age, which can lead to some pretty psychologically damaging effects. When researchers calculated the total cost of achieving the traditional American dream today, which included buying a home, raising 2 kids, sending them to college, being able to afford healthcare and a comfortable retirement, they found that the number was $4.4 million. For context, the median American worker will earn about $1.7 million over their entire working lifetime. So the American dream costs more than twice what most people will ever make. What do we have here? We have college. You're potentially taking on a ton of debt to go to college. You are graduating. Entry-level jobs in many fields are actually lower today when adjusted for inflation than they were in the 1970s. So you're potentially entering a low cost entry-level salary. Maybe you're picking up gig work because you're unable to afford necessities in today's high cost of inflation. And things like saving for retirement and buying a home are feeling unbelievably out of reach. So you basically feel like you just cannot get ahead no matter what you do. And so what's the psychological impact of that? When you think about traditional financial advice, which is like, stop buying overpriced lattes, stop buying these like frivolous things, it doesn't match the moment of what Gen Z is going through. Because if you think about it, cutting out a $5 latte every day is not going to move the needle when it comes to something like saving for a down payment. But something else I want to touch on before I get into the impacts is sort of the expectation inflation trap that I don't think is talked about enough when we think about, how Gen Z is approaching their finances. So while systemic barriers have made reaching those traditional American dream milestones harder, there's also another force at play, which is that our expectations of the good life have inflated dramatically. A recent survey found that Gen Z thinks that the threshold for financial success is an average annual salary of nearly $600,000 and a net worth of $9.5 million. To put that in perspective, only about 1% of Americans make over $500,000 annually. So by that definition, 99% of Americans are financially unsuccessful. So what is driving this sort of expectation inflation? I have found kind of throughout my research, three psychological forces, all of which have been amplified by social media. So the first is hedonic adaptation on steroids. So in the past, before social media, you were comparing your money to your coworkers, to your neighbors. But now, because of social media, you have access to seeing tens of thousands, even millions of people's money. And, now the, reference pool or what you're comparing your money to is so much bigger. It's celebrities, it's influencers. And so the baseline for normal keeps rising. I always say that wealth is completely relative. And if you are constantly surrounding with your feed and who you hang out with, but with the millionaires and billionaires, you're going to feel, inadequate in comparison. Second is the algorithm. Social media shows us the most engaging content, typically the extreme successes, sometimes the extreme failures. So we're often not seeing reality. We are seeing sort of the highlight reels of the top 1%, much of which is often not even real. It's very easy to fake that you are wealthy on social media, and a lot of people wouldn't be able to know the difference. Third, there's also this toxic narrative that wealth is primarily a mindset issue, especially among younger consumers. You see this everywhere. Like financial success is about, just putting your mind to it instead of recognizing these structural factors that got people in the position that they're in. And like the appeal of this is obvious, right? Like if wealth is just a mindset, anyone can achieve it, right? But the dark side of this is that it makes poverty a personal failure rather than the potential result of systemic inequality. And this can create a perfect storm where it can make it feel like it's impossible to reach these goals while expectations are continuing to grow up. So what happens when Gen Z stops believing the American dream? They don't just continue on business as usual, right? This has reshaped our entire collective psyche and how we think about money. So I want to talk about three major responses emerging and how they're reshaping our entire economic ecosystem. The first is what I call like sort of arrested development or a delayed adulthood, in that we see a lot of Gen Z kind of postponing these traditional milestones because they seem fundamentally unattainable. They're living with their parents longer, they're buying homes later, they're, almost like quote unquote failing to launch. And that doesn't mean that they're behind in any way. And it's not delayed gratification. It's when people stop orienting their lives around these milestones that made up the traditional American dream. They think like, why bother saving for a house when, prices are rising faster than I could possibly save? Why save for retirement when, the world might not even exist in like 50 years? And I think we see that in a lot of the social behavior of Gen Z as well. Like marriage rates are going down, birth rates are going down. And again, there's this narrative that represents a failure to launch, but in my opinion, it's a little bit more strategic. It's sort of this conscious sacrifice of short-term independence for long-term stability. And the data really does back this up. Young adults who live with their parents typically end up with better financial outcomes, more savings, less debt, higher credit scores. So it might not be that they're failing to launch, but that they're launching more strategically. The second response to sort of the belief that the American dream is dead is that if traditional paths seem blocked, entrepreneurship becomes a salvation. And what do I mean by that? I mean the kind of explosion of the gig economy, of influencing, of working for yourself. And the numbers back this up. The number of Americans identifying as self-employed reached 17 million people in 2024, and so much of this is wrapped up in the creator economy that's, propped up by social media. And social media really overflows with this idea of hustle culture and working for yourself and the freedoms of, being an influencer and working for yourself. And the promise is sort of all the same with all of this. Traditional employment has failed you, but this path is going to get you kind of to these infinite riches. It's very like high risk, but potentially high reward. And you see this also kind of coupled with what I call the grift economy, where when the traditional passive wealth building are blocked, scams and grifting will flourish. And you see this with like drop shifting, people trying to sell you courses and scams and all that kind of stuff. And of course, a lot of this doesn't like end up, getting anybody rich. But this narrative is very appealing because it offers something that traditional employment doesn't, which is a sense of control. So when the latter seems broken, people want to build their own. But it's a psychological trap, right? When entrepreneurship becomes the answer to economic challenges, then again, like the first thing, financial struggle becomes your fault, not a direct reflection of systemic factors, but a direct reflection of your own work ethic, which again is a very dangerous mindset to be in. So the third response is the death of the American dream, which to me is the most concerning and sort of like wrapped up in the other two responses, is financial nihilism, sort of the belief that the economic game is so rigged that it is pointless to kind of do anything with your money. And you see this show up in headlines around like revenge spending and, YOLO spending, sort of this really high consumption driven by the belief that long-term goals are unattainable. So you might as well just enjoy the present, and I think this resonates with a lot of young people because it reflects the complete breakdown of the financial system's basic psychological contract that sacrifice today leads to reward tomorrow. It's sort of like learned helplessness applied to personal finance. And when people repeatedly follow traditional advice and don't make any progress, they're going to stop trying altogether. And I think this also comes from generational resentment around, Gen Z. So if you feel like the previous generations pulled up the economic ladder behind them, why would you necessarily follow their financial rules? And obviously a lot of this is doom and gloom, but what gives me hope is that the American dream might not fully be dead. It could be transforming into something more sustainable and aligned with human flourishing. Instead of accumulating as much money as possible, many young people are building more financial resilience, the ability to withstand shocks and adapt to change. This means building up their emergency funds, having multiple income streams. And research shows that those with financial resilience report higher well-being than those who are purely focused on building wealth. We see this in a lot of like survey spending data. Gen Z spends more money on experiences, travel, education, and this aligns with, research showing that experiences contribute to more happiness than possessions. And I think we kind of see these like undercurrents of Gen Z rejecting a lot of consumerist culture and kind of prioritizing their own well-being and happiness first. When you can't afford traditional success markers, focusing on what actually makes you happy could become more rational to you. So I think if you're struggling to think about what the American dream means for you and what your financial goals are, I think maybe the question isn't what am I saving for, but what kind of life am I building? And maybe the answer doesn't include a white picket fence and a 30-year mortgage. The core promise of the American dream, that life should offer progress and reward effort. I think that belief is valuable, but it needs updating for current reality. I don't think humans need unlimited wealth to survive. We need security, autonomy, purpose, and much of that does not require extreme wealth. It requires intention, community, systems that support human flourishing. So, I think the American dream previously that centered around these single family homes, lifetime employment, that might be out of reach, but there are new dreams taking shape. And, the transformation isn't happening to Gen Z, it's being led by Gen Z. And I think the rest of us have, really a lot to learn.